Picture yourself pushing open a heavy wooden door. The stench hits you first. Stale ale mixed with unwashed bodies, rotting rushes on the floor, and something else you can't quite identify but wish you could forget. Your eyes adjust to the dim interior, lit only by tallow candles that add their own greasy smoke to the already thick air. Welcome to a medieval tavern, where the romantic fantasy of cozy firelight and hearty meals collides with a reality so grim that modern health inspectors would seal the place shut within minutes. Today, we're stepping past the Hollywood myths and Renaissance fair fantasies to uncover what medieval taverns were actually like. This is the history they don't tell you in the storybooks, where knights toasted in gleaming halls. This is the filthy, dangerous, disease-ridden truth about the places where ordinary medieval people gathered to drink, eat, and sometimes die. Medieval drinking establishments came in 3 distinct varieties, each serving different social levels but united by one thing: questionable hygiene. Alehouses were the humblest, often nothing more than someone's home where the wife had brewed a fresh batch. These weren't dedicated buildings. They were domestic spaces temporarily converted into drinking spots, identified by an ale stake thrust out the front door or a broom left drying after being used to stir the brew. 1/3 of women in some medieval villages brewed ale for sale at various times, turning their living quarters into impromptu public houses where neighbors gathered. Taverns occupied the middle ground. These were actual commercial establishments, usually owned by vintners or brewers who had secured licenses from local guilds. They catered to slightly wealthier clientele and focused primarily on wine imported from France, along with cider and perry made from fermented fruits. Unlike alehouses, taverns were dedicated buildings with multiple rooms, storage cellars, and the capacity to hold significant crowds. But don't mistake dedicated building for clean building. Inns stood at the top of this hierarchy. They provided not just food and drink, but lodging for travelers, stables for horses, and storage for merchant goods. Innkeeping was genuinely big business. These establishments occupied prime locations in town squares or where trade roads converged, and their owners wielded considerable economic and political power. Some inns even acted as informal banks. Yet despite their relative sophistication and importance, even the finest medieval inn would make a modern budget motel look like a palace of cleanliness. If you needed a place to sleep at a medieval tavern or inn, prepare yourself for an experience that would horrify anyone accustomed to even basic privacy. Most establishments offered communal sleeping arrangements where a dozen or more beds might be crammed into a single room. But it gets worse. Each bed didn't hold just one person. 3 or 4 strangers would be assigned to share the same mattress, lying side by side through the night. The mattresses themselves were stuffed with straw, corn husks, or if you were lucky, feathers. These natural materials provided some comfort, but also created perfect breeding grounds for fleas, bed bugs, and lice. One previous traveler bringing parasites would infest the bedding, and then every subsequent guest would carry those parasites onward to the next inn. The mattresses rested on rope supports strung across the bed frame, and these ropes would sag over time, causing everyone to roll toward the middle of the bed. Imagine trying to sleep while slowly sliding toward 2 or 3 unwashed strangers in the darkness. Women travelers were occasionally given separate rooms, but they rarely traveled alone anyway. If a woman and her husband arrived, they might be accommodated in a bed, even if it meant evicting a single male traveler. The dispossessed man would then be reassigned to another bed, already occupied by other strangers. There were rules for proper bed-sharing etiquette. Sleepers were expected to minimize fidgeting, avoid physical contact with bed companions, and lie still through the night regardless of discomfort. For those who couldn't afford even these communal beds, poorer establishments offered an even grimmer alternative. Some taverns had nothing more than wooden benches with a rope strung horizontally at chest height. Travelers would crowd along these benches, hanging their arms over the rope for support, sleeping, sitting up like passengers crammed into a medieval subway car. Come morning, everyone would be cleared out and the area washed down, ready for the next night's unfortunate occupants. Medieval tavern food deserves its own horror story. At the most basic level, taverns served simple fare: bread, cheese, herring, bacon, and various roast meats. The problem wasn't what was on the menu, but what was actually in your bowl. Food safety standards didn't exist. Refrigeration didn't exist. Health inspections were minimal at best. What arrived at your table might have been sitting in storage for days or weeks, slowly spoiling in conditions that encouraged bacterial growth. Meat pies were particularly suspect. The crusts were often so dense and hard they weren't meant to be eaten at all, but served merely as edible containers. What went inside those crusts raised concerns. While we can't verify every tavern's practices, historical records reveal that regulations were eventually passed in some regions prohibiting the use of certain questionable meats in food sold to the public. The fact that such laws needed to be written suggests that before their enactment, standards were considerably lower. When tavern keepers wanted to save money or dispose of animals that had died under unclear circumstances, the contents of pies and stews could become highly questionable. Stews posed their own dangers. Some taverns kept a pot of perpetual stew simmering constantly, adding new ingredients whenever supplies arrived. This wasn't necessarily a bad practice in theory. A properly maintained perpetual stew could remain safe and flavorful if kept at the correct temperature and stirred frequently. But maintaining such standards required constant vigilance. Without proper care, the bottom of these pots could harbor ingredients that hadn't cooked thoroughly, while the surface looked acceptably bubbling. Historical warnings about tavern food quality suggest that not all establishments maintained the necessary standards. Bread served as trenchers, thick slabs that functioned as edible plates. By the time your meal was finished, this bread had absorbed all the juices and fats from whatever you'd been served. If you were hungry enough, you ate it. Otherwise, these gravy-soaked trenchers would be collected. In wealthier establishments, they might be given to the poor. In taverns, the fate of these scraps varied. Left sitting for hours, they would attract flies and vermin to kitchen areas where the next day's meals were being prepared. Cheese could be aged so hard it was practically wooden. Eggs were relatively safe, but raw produce was feared as potentially dangerous. People believed that raw fruits and vegetables caused illness, so everything was cooked, often overcooked, turning vegetables into mushy, unappetizing matter. This belief wasn't entirely wrong. Without proper washing, raw produce could indeed carry contamination from fields fertilized with human and animal waste. Medieval ale presents one of the greatest ironies of tavern life. People drank ale because water was often unsafe, yet the ale itself was frequently contaminated, spoiled, or dangerous in its own right. Understanding medieval ale requires forgetting everything you know about modern beer. This wasn't the filtered, pasteurized, carefully crafted beverage we drink today. Medieval ale was brewed without hops for much of the period. Hops weren't widely adopted until the 13th and 14th centuries, and they made a crucial difference. Before hops, ale was preserved with a mixture of herbs called groot, which included yarrow, heather, juniper, and bog myrtle. These herbs provided some preservation and flavor, but they couldn't match the preservative power of hops. As a result, unhopped ale spoiled quickly, very quickly. According to period sources, a batch of medieval ale remained drinkable for only 2 to 3 days at most before it was considered spoiled and began turning sour, developing off flavors. Without hops, medieval ale had a limited shelf life. The brewing process itself differed significantly from modern methods. Medieval ale typically wasn't boiled after the initial mashing of grains, which meant proteins and potential contaminants remained in the liquid. These provided nourishment not just to drinkers, but to bacteria that could multiply. While stronger ales with higher alcohol content could last longer, weaker everyday ales would begin spoiling relatively quickly, developing sour flavors within days or weeks depending on the strength and storage conditions. Tavern keepers faced constant pressure to brew frequently and sell quickly. An alewife or tavern keeper who misjudged demand might end up with ale beginning to spoil. While regulations existed regarding ale quality, with officials called ale conners tasked with testing the product, enforcement varied. Historical records show that brewers who produced weak or contaminated ale faced fines, but a desperate brewer might serve questionable ale and hope customers wouldn't complain until after purchase. Some taverns may have used heavy spicing, not for flavor alone, but to mask the taste of ale that had started to turn. The serving conditions made things worse. Ale was stored in wooden barrels that were difficult to clean thoroughly. Residue from previous batches, combined with naturally occurring yeasts in the environment, meant that every new batch risked contamination from whatever had been in that barrel before. Taverns that served both food and drink faced additional challenges, as food waste and spills created breeding grounds for bacteria that could find their way into the ale supply. Let's address the question nobody in medieval times wanted to think about. Where did people relieve themselves in a tavern? The answer is as unpleasant as you're imagining, possibly worse. Most taverns had no toilets at all. None. The concept of indoor plumbing wouldn't arrive for centuries. Even basic privies were often absent. In the best cases, a tavern might have a designated area outside. Perhaps a simple pit latrine or a corner of the yard where nature calls were answered. Larger establishments in cities might have access to public latrines, sometimes built over bridges so waste fell directly into rivers. But during a crowded evening, when dozens of people were drinking heavily, the facilities, such as they were, couldn't accommodate the demand. Medieval cities and towns had laws against public urination and defecation. A famous case from 1307 records a groom who got into a fight with Londoners who confronted him for urinating on a side street. They told him it would be more decent to use the common privies, but such confrontations suggest the laws were regularly broken. Tavern patrons who needed relief during a busy night might simply step into an alley or courtyard rather than wait for facilities or venture far in the dark. Inside the tavern itself, the floors were covered with rushes, essentially dried reeds or grasses scattered across the packed earth. These rushes were supposed to provide insulation and a softer surface than bare ground. They also absorbed spills, tracked in mud, food scraps, and yes, bodily fluids from patrons too drunk to make it outside. Over time, these rushes became compressed, rotting layers that harbored filth, insects, and disease. When they were finally changed, which might not happen for weeks or months, the underlying mess was spectacular in its foulness. Chamber pots might be provided in sleeping areas, but their contents had to be disposed of somewhere. Often this meant simply dumping them out windows or into street gutters. The practice was so common that people learned to shout warnings before emptying chamber pots from upper windows. But in the chaos and darkness of a medieval tavern, not everyone bothered with warnings. Medieval taverns earned their reputation as dangerous places. Research into court records from late medieval Dubrovnik found that fighting was the single most common crime documented in tavern cases, accounting for a significant majority of offenses. These weren't just minor scuffles. Armed men carrying knives would get into arguments over debts, insults, women, or simply because they were drunk and aggressive. Many of these fights ended in serious injury or death. The triggers for violence were often trivial by modern standards, but serious in a culture where honor and reputation mattered intensely. Pulling someone's beard was considered a grave provocation. Insults directed at someone's mother could spark immediate violence. One historical record preserves the insult that started a fight. "Your mother is a whore and witch." Another fight began when someone was called a bastard. These weren't empty words in a society where legitimacy and family reputation determined one's social standing and opportunities. Tavern keepers themselves were frequently the instigators. Far from being neutral peacekeepers, they often started fights, especially when disputes arose over payment or accusations of serving watered-down drinks. In one case from 1374, a tavern keeper accused a patron of assault, but testimony revealed the keeper had actually started the fight himself after refusing to accept payment for a broken jug. The accusation was simply an attempt to avoid responsibility and possibly extract compensation. Gambling was endemic in taverns despite being condemned by church authorities, and often illegal. Dice games were especially popular and especially ruinous. Historical records document men losing clothing, livestock, and property in dice games. The dice themselves were smaller than modern dice, with sharp edges. This detail becomes significant when considering recorded punishments for cheating, which could include having the fraudulent die pierced through the palm of the cheater's hand. Such a wound would leave a permanent scar, marking them as untrustworthy in future games. Card games also flourished in taverns, though playing cards didn't become widespread until the 15th century. Both dice and cards were often played for stakes that workers couldn't afford to lose, yet the combination of alcohol and peer pressure drove people to gamble away essential resources. The resulting financial ruin led to more crime as desperate men turned to theft or violence to recover their losses or settle gambling debts. Women committed far fewer crimes in taverns, but they were involved in verbal insults and theft more than physical violence. Prostitution was another common feature of tavern life, though it existed in a complicated legal and social space. Some taverns essentially operated as brothels, with prostitution being their real business and alcohol merely a cover. Other establishments tried to maintain respectability but couldn't entirely prevent sex workers from soliciting customers among the drinking patrons. Rats were everywhere in medieval cities and towns. They infested homes, shops, markets, and taverns with impunity. The connection between rats and disease wasn't understood, but people certainly knew that rats were pests that contaminated food supplies and spread filth. Yet controlling them proved nearly impossible with medieval technology. Taverns with their food storage, spilled ale, and accumulated waste provided ideal habitat for rat colonies. These weren't the occasional mouse scurrying across the floor. Archaeological evidence shows that black rat populations had grown from relatively small numbers in the early Middle Ages to more significant populations by the 11th and 13th centuries in some regions. Rats traveled along trade routes, spreading with human commerce, and they thrived in the increasingly dense urban environments of late medieval Europe. The rodents living in taverns did more than simply disturb patrons. They contaminated food stores, chewed through barrels and bags, and left droppings throughout the building. They died in walls and under floors, creating terrible smells. Most seriously, they carried fleas that could spread disease. The Black Death, which killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, has traditionally been attributed to fleas on black rats. However, modern research suggests the transmission was more complex, possibly involving human-to-human spread through body lice and fleas. Regardless of the exact mechanism, taverns with their high traffic of travelers from multiple regions would have been potential transmission points for epidemic disease. Pest control in medieval times was primitive. Rat catchers existed as a profession, but they relied on sticks, clubs, and sometimes trained dogs or ferrets. Poisons were available but dangerous, as arsenic used to kill rats could also poison humans if it contaminated food or drink. Some establishments tried various folk remedies, including writing letters to the mice asking them politely to leave and promising them a field of their own if they departed. As you might imagine, this method proved ineffective. Taverns attracted more than just ordinary workers and travelers. Historical records describe them as gathering places for criminals, fugitives, and the dangerous elements of medieval society. Contemporary accounts portray taverns as refuges for rogues and scoundrels. places where illegal activities could flourish under the cover of legitimate business. Based on what we know from court records and contemporary writings, certain taverns likely served as bases of operation for highway robbers, who could gather information about wealthy travelers and plan their activities. Press gangs are known to have recruited in taverns, looking for drunk men who could be forced into military or naval service. Corrupt officials may have conducted questionable deals in tavern back rooms, away from public scrutiny. Some taverns essentially functioned as criminal headquarters. Court records occasionally reveal connections between tavern keepers and known criminals. One documented case from medieval Abbeville involved a publican arrested for arson, who was released after lobbying from influential friends, including the local priest and mayor. Later investigation revealed questionable connections among various parties in the case. While the full scope of such criminal networks is difficult to reconstruct from surviving records, these cases suggest that corruption and criminal activity penetrated deeper into tavern life than official accounts typically acknowledged. Murder in taverns occurred frequently enough that authorities often didn't investigate thoroughly. In documented cases, customers who got into fights and fled the scene would later turn up dead, but investigations would be minimal or inconclusive. These deaths were sometimes seen as the predictable consequence of tavern life, particularly when the victims and perpetrators were themselves on the margins of society. Given everything we've discussed, the filth, danger, disease, and general unpleasantness, why did medieval people frequent taverns? The answer reveals something important about medieval life. They had little choice. Taverns weren't optional luxuries. They were essential social infrastructure. For travelers, taverns and inns were the only option for food and shelter between destinations. Medieval roads offered no drive-through restaurants or highway motels. If you were traveling for trade, pilgrimage, or any other reason, you stopped at taverns because there was nowhere else to stop. The alternative was sleeping outdoors, which meant exposure to weather, wild animals, and bandits without even the minimal security of walls and other people. For locals, taverns served as community gathering spaces. Most medieval people lived in small, cramped homes with entire families sharing single rooms. Privacy didn't exist. Entertainment options were limited. Taverns offered a place to socialize with neighbors, hear news from travelers, conduct business deals, and escape the claustrophobic confines of home. Yes, the tavern was filthy and dangerous, but so was almost everywhere else in medieval life. Drinking itself served important social and practical functions. Ale and wine, despite their problems, were often safer than water drawn from contaminated wells or rivers. The alcohol content in the brewing process killed some pathogens, making fermented beverages less likely to cause immediate illness than raw water. This wasn't always true, and people certainly got sick from bad ale, but the perception that ale was safer persisted. Taverns also played crucial economic roles. Merchants used them as informal offices where deals were negotiated and contracts signed. Craftsmen met potential customers and displayed their skills. Information flowed through taverns as travelers shared news from other regions. Local governments sometimes met in tavern halls. The buildings might have been disgusting, but they served functions that medieval society needed and had no better way to fulfill. Medieval taverns were not the cozy, romantic establishments of fantasy novels and movies. They were filthy, dangerous, disease-ridden places where people went because they had to, not because they wanted to. The food could poison you. The ale was often spoiled. The sleeping arrangements guaranteed you'd share both bed and parasites with strangers. Violence was common and sometimes deadly. Rats infested every corner. The sanitation would make a modern person physically ill just thinking about it. Yet these establishments stood at the heart of medieval social and economic life. They reveal the harsh realities of medieval existence, where survival meant accepting conditions we would find intolerable. The next time you see a movie scene set in a medieval tavern with clean-faced actors drinking from spotless tankards in well-lit comfort, remember what those places really were. Remember the rats, the vermin-infested beds, the questionable stew, and the ever-present threat of violence. This was history without the Hollywood gloss, the medieval world as it actually existed for ordinary people trying to get through another day in conditions we can barely imagine. These taverns, for all their horror, kept medieval society functioning. They provided the necessary infrastructure of food, shelter, and gathering spaces that allowed commerce, travel, and community life to continue. Understanding what they were really like helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how much our ancestors endured. If you found this journey into the darker corners of medieval history fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We dig into the forgotten truths and uncomfortable realities that textbooks often skip. History wasn't clean, wasn't simple, and definitely wasn't romantic. But it was real. And understanding that reality makes us appreciate our modern world all the more. Leave a comment telling us about the most surprising fact you learned today, and we'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore more of the gritty truths hiding behind historical myths.